The story starts with a young boxer named Young. At just 16, he had already become a local celebrity thanks to his amazing boxing skills. One night, after winning a big match, Young was in a rush to get home. His mom and sister were waiting for him, and he couldn't wait to see them. But when he got there, what he found wasn't what he expected. Instead of warm hugs and congratulations, he walked into a nightmare. His mother and sister were lying there, lifeless. Suddenly, a man attacked him from behind. But Young, being the skilled boxer he was, quickly fought back and killed the attacker. Fast forward 2 years, in a school somewhere in town, a group of boys were talking about Young's story. They had heard that the people who attacked his family were actually thieves, and Young had taken them all down with his bare hands. Unfortunately, even though he acted in self-defense, he was charged with murder and sent to prison. One of the boys listening in was Subin, a new student at the school. Subin had switched schools to escape the bullying he faced at his previous one. He was finally starting to settle in and feel at ease when one day, the teacher introduced a new kid to the class, Tony. Subin froze when he saw him. Tony was a boxer too, and he used to be one of the bullies who tormented Subin at his old school. Seeing Tony again brought back all the fear Subin thought he had left behind. As soon as the teacher left the classroom, Tony wasted no time establishing his dominance. He started picking on and beating some kids for no reason, showing everyone who was in charge. Eventually, he made his way to Subin, intending to do the same. Subin stayed silent, too scared to stand up for himself. That's when one of his friends stepped in to protect him, but Tony didn't care. He pushed the girl aside and even raised his hand to slap her. For the first time in his life, Subin found the courage to stop Tony. But instead of backing down, Tony got even angrier. He planned to beat Subin. Fearing for his safety, Subin grabbed a pen to defend himself. Tony just taunted him, repeating, "Go ahead, use pen, hit me, you weakling." Seeing no way out and caught in Tony's grip, Subin panicked. Without thinking, he stabbed the pen into Tony's eye. What's next? Subin was charged with attempted murder, but when it came time to testify in court, he couldn't bring himself to speak up against Tony. As a result, he was sentenced to 2 years in prison. On the bus ride to jail, Subin found himself seated next to none other than Young, the infamous boxer. Once they arrived at the prison, the inmates were split into different cells. Subin was placed with a thief named Min, and the two quickly became friends. It wasn't long before a fellow inmate told them about the dangerous situation within the prison walls. There were 3 powerful prisoners who ruled the place: Jun, Akio, and Han. Jun was the most reasonable of the 3, often stepping in to stop Akio and Han from bullying the other prisoners. But recently, Akio and Han set a trap for Jun, and as a result, the police had locked him away in solitary confinement. With Jun out of the way, Akio and Han freely terrorized the other inmates. However, the most feared prisoner of all was still Young. Even though everyone was afraid of him, Young had his own code. He never fought without a good reason. The next day, Subin and Min stood silently, watching a football match between Akio and Han. Suddenly, 2 players got hurt, and Han called Subin and Min over to his team, inviting them to play together. Both boys silently agreed, but Subin was nervous. He didn't know much about playing football. As a result, Han's team started losing, and Subin was unwilling to take any responsibility for the defeat in any circumstances. In frustration, Subin kicked the ball with his eyes closed, but by mistake, it went right between Akio's legs. The unexpected kick caused Akio to stumble, and he fell to the ground in pain, furious about what had just happened. His friends immediately began dragging Subin toward their cell. Terrified, Subin recalled the bullying he had endured at his previous school and started begging for mercy, but his pleas fell on deaf ears. Just then, they noticed Young walking by. Instantly, they switched their behavior, acting as if they were friends with Subin. Seeing this, Subin realized that everyone in the prison respected Young. Fearing for his safety, he ran toward Young for help. Although Young typically avoided unnecessary trouble, but he couldn't ignore Subin's desperate pleas. When Akio tried to stop him, Young quickly knocked him down with a single punch. In the prison, the kids received lessons, but during class, Akio's glare remained fixed on Subin. He was determined to teach him a lesson at any cost. Immediately after class, a guard took Subin to meet someone, and to his shock, it was Tony. One of Tony's eyes was now severely damaged, a consequence of their previous encounter, and he had been expelled from school. Since then, Tony had been living on the streets, and he believed that all his misfortunes were Subin's fault. Fueled by anger, he was determined to kill Subin at any cost. As Tony loomed over him, Subin instinctively began begging for his life, but his pleas fell on deaf ears. During the confrontation, Subin's eyes caught a glimpse of Young, who was training nearby. In that moment, a realization struck him: he still had 2 years left in prison, and if he learned boxing well, he might stand a chance at protecting himself. Without hesitation, Subin approached Young and asked him to be his trainer. At first, Young refused, suspecting that Subin might try to exploit his abilities. However, when Subin expressed his desire to change and recounted his experiences, Young began to believe that Subin was serious about staying on the right path. Still, Young insisted that Subin would need to prove himself first. He set a grueling test. Subin had to complete 100 laps around the training ground within 40 minutes. This training was crucial for Subin's survival, so he started running, fueled by the haunting memories of his past mistreatment. As he pushed himself to the limit, Subin refused to stop, even when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him. With each passing lap, the images of his torment played in his mind, driving him forward. And hence he was ready to die but not to stop. By the final rounds, he was utterly spent, but Young saw the determination in Subin's eyes and called for him to stop. However, Subin, resolute in his mission, was determined to pass the test at any cost. By the time Subin was nearing his breaking point, he was so exhausted that he almost fainted. Just then, Young caught him before he hit the ground. Looking at Subin's condition, Young realized just how important it was for him to learn boxing. It was essential for his survival, so he quickly asked the jailer to move Subin to his room. Fortunately, the jailer was a fan of Young and recognized that he was a good person, so he agreed without hesitation. From the very next day, Young began training Subin. However, seeing how weak Subin was, he knew he'd have to push him hard. Meanwhile, Akio was plotting his revenge. His friends reminded him that Min was with Subin that day, and they thought maybe they could use Min to separate Subin from Young. As training went on, Subin was utterly drained. He longed for a break, but Young quickly reminded him that he wouldn't learn boxing with that kind of attitude. Inspired by Young's words, Subin forced himself to keep going. He worked tirelessly over the next few days, and slowly but surely, his body began to transform. During this time, a strong friendship began to blossom between Subin and Young. Outside the prison walls, Tony was getting into fights with every thug in the city, trying to prove himself. One day, during one of these scuffles, a notorious gangster noticed him. Impressed by Tony's skills, the gangster offered him a job, but Tony wasn't interested and insulted the gangster instead. In response, the gangster knocked him out with a single slap. Afterward, the gangster gave Tony one last chance to accept the offer. Desperate for money, Tony finally agreed to work for him, realizing he had no other choice. During lunch in the prison, Min leaned in and told Subin that soon, Young would be transferred to another prison. He would be sent away. He warned Subin that once that happened, he'd be left defenseless against Akio. Subin felt a wave of disappointment wash over him. Young hadn't mentioned anything about this, and he needed to talk to him right away. When Subin confronted Young, he explained that one day, Subin would have to stand up for himself, and that day was fast approaching. Subin nodded, understanding the importance of Young's words, and threw himself back into training. Meanwhile, Akito's gang was harassing Min. Subin seized this and rushed over. When they tried to threaten him, Subin unleashed his boxing skills, easily taking them down. News of his victory spread quickly to Akio, who ordered his goons to bring Subin to him immediately. But now, Akio's men were the ones scared of a fight. They approached Subin, terrified, and asked for his help. Subin, feeling the pressure, went to face Akio himself. He started by apologizing for any previous misunderstandings, but Akio wasn't having any of it. Without warning, he attacked him. But Subin was no longer the same. He fought back in self-defense. Although Akio was still stronger, Subin held his ground. After a fierce struggle, Akio threw him to the ground, and everyone assumed the fight was over. But Subin, fueled by determination, jumped back up and started to land blows on Akio, until Young stepped in to stop him. After that, they quietly left the scene. Meanwhile, Tony's reputation was growing in the city, and he was becoming more and more dangerous each day. Back in the gym, Subin's training with Young had reached a turning point. During one session, Subin was to about punch Young in the face, and with this their journey also ends here, because Young was being transferred to another prison that same day. Before leaving, Young told Subin to keep working hard. Once Young left, Jun and Han were also released, meaning that the prison was about to change. However, Han challenged Subin to a fight, promising that if Subin won, he would never bully anyone in the prison again. They agreed to meet in 5 days. In the meantime, Tony returned to see Subin, intrigued by the buzz surrounding his training. Instead of being intimidated, he was excited about the upcoming showdown. When the day of the fight arrived, Han and Subin pushed each other to their limits. Han, unable to keep up with Subin's hard work, ultimately accepted his defeat and honored his promise. From that day on, no one was bullied in the prison, and gradually, all the factions became friends. 2 years passed, and when Subin finally walked out of prison, he was ready to face the world. In a rematch against Tony, both fighters were so agile that they couldn't land a hit on each other at first. But soon, Tony returned to his aggressive ways, trying to overpower Subin. Just as Tony landed a punch, Subin remembered Young's training and stood tall. He used a special technique Young had taught him, landing a decisive punch that knocked Tony down for good. Afterward, Subin walked away quietly, knowing that his friendship with Young remained strong, even from a distance. And here our story ends, and guys, most importantly, if you liked this video and want to see more videos, then please subscribe to us. Thanks for watching.